Hi there, this is Jim from Trek World, and today we're going to take an in-depth look at what may very well be the most iconic miniature ever built. The 11-foot, 2-inch long USS Enterprise model from the classic TV series Star Trek. In early 1964, Desilu Studios ordered a pilot for a new science fiction television show. In the very height of America's love affair with westerns, Gene Roddenberry's sale pitch promised the studio that it would be a futuristic wagon train to the stars. Now, ironically, it would be later understood that Lucille Ball didn't actually understand what she had gotten the studio into when she first approved the production of the first pilot. However, after finding out it was a science fiction series, she doubled down on her support by financing both pilots before they got an order from NBC. In order to sell it to the network for the NBC Fall 1965 season, Desilu needed to have the pilot in the can and ready to go no later than early spring 1965. Now, one of the very first problems that needed to be addressed is, what does the spaceship look like? Roddenberry knew one thing immediately. It wasn't going to look like any of the stereotypical spaceships featured in movies and television up to that time. No rockets, no flying saucers, and absolutely no flaming exhausts. Now, using those constraints, the task fell to one Matt Jeffries to design a spaceship that would look like a true spaceship, but could not look like any spaceships that had come before. Over the next few weeks, Matt would present Gene with sketches. Gene would tell him what he liked and what he didn't like about each design. Little by little, a composite design began to form. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the worldwide debut of the Starship Enterprise. Now, before we move on, I want to take the moment to point out a few items from this signed sketch all the way back in 1964. Many folks have asked about the origin of the registry numbers. The lower left-hand corner tells us in Matt's own handwriting that 17 represented a sequential number used by Starfleet for each new ship. Also, take a look at this. Note that the concept of potential refits were considered all the way back in 1965 when he made his note about NCC 1701A. Now, at the very end of this process, the elegant and unique design that would enthrall viewers for decades began to come into view. These last two color drawings show the top and lateral elevations of the proposed model. Also note here that the name in this last drawing is SS Enterprise. Also of note is the notation about the paired power units. An interesting anecdote of Star Trek history is that Matt never used the word nacelle for these. He would refer to them as power units during the original series, and then later as power pods all the way up through Star Trek the Motion Picture. To obtain the final sign off from Roddenberry, Matt created a 4-inch model in balsa wood and showed it to Gene. Now, unfortunately, this 4-inch model was lost to time as the decades passed. I've never been able to find any specific evidence or references on what happened to the model. There are lots of urban legends, but nothing you can quite nail down. With the new design approved, the Howard Anderson Company then subcontracted to Richard C. Dayton the order to build 2 models of the Enterprise. Now, Dayton would receive the original blue lines from Matt, dated November 7th, 1964. Using them, he would begin construction of the 33-inch reference model. Excuse me, Jim, did you mean to say blueprints were used in the construction? Funny you should ask. Longtime viewers of the channel will be familiar with my fascination with things my mother called useless knowledge. It is my uncanny ability to remember things like who was the only US president to be single, while still not being able to tell you what it was I ate for dinner last night. By the way, the president was James A. Buchanan. He was the president before Abraham Lincoln. The beginnings of the mid 1970s brought us the Star Trek Starfleet Technical Manual and the Star Trek Blueprints, serving as a template that everything would similarly follow afterwards. Almost every blueprint you have ever seen associated with Star Trek isn't really a blueprint. In reality, the drawings are what the architectural world calls blue lines. The reason is because they are printed on white backgrounds, whereas blueprints are printed appropriately on, guess what? A blue background. Instead, we will show you an actual set of real Star Trek blueprints and a sample of one of the many blueprints from the TV show Mythbusters. And now we'll return you to your regular scheduled programming. But meanwhile, back at the Dayton household, Richard used the drawings that Matt had provided of the 33-inch model. Now, over the years, there have been many photos of drawings and blueprints published that were purported to be the final set used by Dayton for the construction. Richard Dayton mentions that the ones specifically in the Star Trek sketchbook, as well as the ones mentioned in Inside Star Trek, are not the actual set. Now, how can he be sure of this? Simple. He had the only set used in the construction of the models in personal possession all of these years. Paul Newett was kind enough to provide this photo of Dayton and the drawings, which were taken during a visit with Dayton. In the meantime, Dayton reached out and subcontracted the model production shop to build what he referred to as the 4x model. Just 2 weeks after being given the drawings, Dayton delivered the very first studio model ever built of the Starship Enterprise. Somewhere around mid-November, measuring at 33 inches, it was made almost entirely from solid wood. Now, by this point, work hadn't even begun on the larger model, so Gene made the decision to actually use the smaller model for filming, as it was ready far earlier than the larger model. Saving the larger model for a single shot, he quickly gave a list of changes that he wanted made in the meantime. Among these, Gene asked Dayton to paint windows on the surface of the models. Now, about a month later in mid December, Dayton delivered the updated small model to Gene, and these two shots were taken on the old 40 acres lot where they were actually filming the cage. In the first picture, you see Gene examining the model while Richard Dayton holds it. Now, never one to miss a publicity shot, Gene had another photo taken with the star of the pilot, Jeffrey Hunter, holding the model for Roddenberry to inspect. The work on the larger model begins on December 8, 1964. Now, amazingly, this is the only known photo depicting the actual construction of the model. Originally part of a magazine article, it shows Mel Keys and Vernon Sion creating the plaster molds, which would then be used to create the saucer section for the model. On December 29, 1964, about a week after all shooting had been completed, the 11-foot model was delivered to the Howard A. Anderson studio at Desilu. Now, amazingly enough, the builders decided to take a few photos of the model as they offloaded it into the streets at the Desilu location. None of these men would ever have guessed that the photos they were taking that day would become world famous over the next 50 years. Please remember that at this point, Richard Dayton believed he had completed both models. He was unaware of any changes that Gene would be asking him to do shortly. As far as Dayton was concerned, they were locked and loaded, and he was moving on to the next thing. So we begin our look at this photo from December 1964, along with the men of the production model shop who built it, left to right, Richard Dayton, Mel Keys, Vernon Sion. Volmer Jensen was not in this photo, but he took the picture. The model itself weighed about 220 pounds and actually required right around $600 worth of materials. Richard Dayton supervised the construction and did all the detail work and subsequent alterations. Now, before we move,
If you have any videos, photos, or documents that you would like to donate to us, please feel free to send them to Jim at trek-world.com or submit them via the web at submit.trek-world.com.
Now, before we move on, here's a slightly different shot of the same three men, but in different positions. Notice how Dayton has his hand resting on the Enterprise. Now, this is another picture taken that day. The difference is that Richard Dayton took this picture, so Vernon, far right, could be in the photo. Please take a note at that blue box that I put around the deflector dish right down there at the bottom. Now, this is the third shot that we're looking at of this model from what appears to be the same distance, however, shows there was a definite time delay between this model shot and all the others. You can see the evidence of this is that the secondary hull does not have the deflector dish attached, although it was attached in every one of the other photographs. Now, I've never seen anyone even notice this or comment anywhere about the missing dish, but it's my belief that they took this photo immediately after unloading the model in the street. Then they attached the dish and took the other photos, which were much more personalized because they were in them. In what has to be one of the most ironic foreshadowing I've ever seen, the original dish would be lost and replaced many times over the ensuing decades. A final note of this particular positioning of the model, they would choose this exact same angle of approach to be featured in the only shot that they would use in the first pilot. This is a shot from the exact same sets of photos, but showing a different angle from the bow. This photo appears to be the last photo of the set that was taken that day. Now, I have to speak about this little guy. This little fellow has found its way across the internet many, many times over the past 15 years or so. However, it's not a real photo. It is actually a photoshopped combination of two different photos, as you can see here. Now, since that day, Star Trek fans have gone out of their way to stand in the same spot and take various photos of the exact same location just to commemorate the fact that they were there at the place that the Enterprise was delivered at. As you search through the internet looking for various versions of the delivery photos, you're going to see a lot of those other photos. This photo got my vote for most creative. And finally, I found what originally appeared at first blush to be just another simple black and white copy of the photos we'd already seen. But that's not entirely the case. As we pull back on the photo to show more of it, you'll notice that this photo's eye line is much higher than the eye line of the others. As such, you can now make out the names of the neighboring businesses. Most photos of this time frame were square, so it could be that the other photos were cropped when they created the original scans off the original photos. Now, during that point in the 1960s, almost every photograph that you would take would come out square. So, my belief is this is an example of what an unretouched original photo looked like. Over the years, they've been enhanced and scanned and colorized, and somewhere along the way, they lost their 1-to-1 square size and ended up with something roughly approaching maybe 4:3. We are coming to the point in this video where things get a little rough. You ask any Star Trek fan about the left side of the Starship Enterprise studio model, and they will gladly tell you the story about how it had never been finished because they ran all the lights and cable through the side when they were filming the studio. While that is 100% correct, it doesn't really tell you the whole story. Like a magician doing magic on a stage, all of these discussions serve to distract you from what was really happening. A handful of people were lucky enough to be able to ask Richard Dayton, why was the left side unadorned? And he gave them the same answer every time that we already knew. And that was, well, there was no reason to put anything on it because they were filming from the other side. But here's the thing, they all asked the wrong question. Everybody gets caught up in the why is it blank questions. Instead of questions about what wasn't there, they should have been questioning things that were there. Ask yourself this, why is a pennant and registry present on a model that would never be filmed? Now, the real story begins to unveil itself when you roll up your sleeves and do some good old fashioned detective work. First, I would like to highlight a comment I received from Gary Kerr concerning the reversed decals that were made to simulate the left side by using the decals in conjunction with flipping the negative of the Enterprise in space. In his comment, he mentions that he noticed evidence of a previously applied banner on the left side of the secondary hull. The 1974 photo he referred to was one of a few existing Polaroids that were taken by the Smithsonian on the day they received the Enterprise. And if you look close, you can in fact see the ghost of the image that he's talking about. So why would a studio, who never spent a single cent unless they had to, pay to have the left nacelle and a portion of the secondary hull adorned with banners, pennants, and registry numbers? The answer to this comes from a biography of Richard Dayton written by his children. In that biography, they used his own handwritten notes and comments to ensure that his legacy would never be forgotten. And trust me, his legacy had been questioned time and time again. In fact, he was quite profusive in his notes about these people spreading disinformation concerning his roles in the building of the Enterprise model. On page 80 of the book, Richard Dayton tells his daughters something that everybody has denied for the past 50 years. Originally, the left side was as detailed as the right when it was first delivered before it was subjected to changes for lighting requested by Gene, unquote. You might want to take a screenshot of this, folks, because if you were simply want to repeat this statement today, you will be told flat out you don't know what you're talking about. But the fact of the matter is this, no one knows what the left side of that model looked like on the day it was delivered on December 29, 1964. What we do know was that Dayton delivered it in what he considered to be a finished condition. Gene already told him the model would not be lit in any way. He literally was handing the model over to Desilu and then moving on to his next task. After they used the model for the single shot that they talked about, Gene sent it back to Dayton for modifications that resulted in Dayton having to run electric cables through the left side of the model. And that act alone made any further paint, decals, and banners pointless on the left side. So anyone who tells us today that they know the left side of the model was unfinished in December of 1964 is making a claim based solely on urban legends they've heard. They have no evidence of that. Now, if only someone had thought to take a single picture. After all, the picture would have proven once and for all that the left side was completely blank from the beginning, right? Remember Gary Kerr's point. Desilu would not spend a single penny on something they were not going to use. So in order for any paint, registry, or banners to be anywhere on the left side, they would have had to been specifically asked for. And that is something Desilu would not have asked Richard Dayton to do, because if they knew the left side was never going to be seen on television, they wouldn't pay him for that service. Knowing that they also paid Dayton for reversed decals, then why pay for the decals and the left nacelle banners in registry? But what if I could show you proof that the banners were present on the left side of the secondary hull prior to having the electrical cables installed for the second pilot? So I took a gamble. Doug Drexler was part of the team who worked on the amazing 2016 conservation of the model, as was Gary. Surely, if anyone had any knowledge of the history of the left side, it would have been him, or even Gary. So I reached out to Doug Drexler about the possibility. He was pretty much able to send me this photograph fairly quickly. All right, so the quality's not so good, I'll give it that. But you can clearly see that the wires on the left side are running over an existing banner. This matches also the comment that Gary Kerr made about the banner's existence being in evidence in the 1974 Smithsonian picture. Now, if you look at the front of the model, you can clearly see that the windows in the front of the bridge, which means that this was taken when they were shooting where no man has gone before. We also know that Dayton had to drill out the left side holes as a result of Gene's request to install lighting after all. So by itself, this photo does not stand out. But combined with a statement in Dayton's biography, it clearly shows those markings were there to begin with. Now, obviously, there are no known photographs of the model's left side before the second pilot was filmed. After all, if they were, we wouldn't even be having this conversation right now. The fact that the block is not there could be an indication that it had been removed as a result of the work that he had to do to rig the lighting. But I don't have any photos to look at. All I have is his comments about being finished for the cage. But honestly, we don't know why he stripped the pennants, but honestly, we don't even know when the pennants were stripped and left behind the marks that Gary mentioned. So there's really no reason why he couldn't have removed the block as well. We just don't know. Now,
Hi, I was watching your untold story of the Klingon D7. I found it nice, light, and fun. I prefer your type of broadcast versus those that disparage the series, talking about how bad the special effects were and so forth. I don't like those type of videos. I like the ones that celebrate the idea behind Star Trek, the original series, one of the most successful sci-fi franchises in history. And I like the celebration of optimism that the series puts forward. And I found your broadcast informative and nice. My name is Richard Bennett. Thanks. Bye-bye.
don't know. Now, as a follow up to this, about several months ago, Adam Savage got the incredible opportunity to spend some time filming the model while it was receiving an upgrade of its LED lighting that was installed in the previous conservation effort. It did not take long for word to get back to me from you viewers saying that you could actually see where the model's left side originally had the banners. Trust me, that caught my attention as soon as people mentioned that, because I've stared at photographs and I've known people who've stared at the model at the Smithsonian, and nobody's ever talked about that before. I had to go see this for myself. Amazingly enough, when watching his video, you can actually see the exact same red banner outline under the most current paint job done there over 4 years ago. I recommend Adam's video very highly, if for no other reason than the fact that he's managed to photograph something that no one else has been able to confirm in 50 years. So for now, let's return to 1965 and continue our exploration of the history of the changes that were made to this magnificent icon. This photo is probably one of the most recognized images of the Starship Enterprise. Even people who had never seen Star Trek themselves, they'll know both the ship and the show. Now, here you can see our first behind the scenes photo of the 11-foot model that we have here. They suspended her from the ceiling and shot her against a black background, resulting in this beauty shot. We've seen this image before, but did you know it wasn't the whole picture? Well, let's take a simulated step or two backwards, and now you can see the entire picture itself. While she still looks great, the scope of the soundstage is the actual star of this photo. You can see the lights and even how they hung the backdrop. This is the only photo I've ever seen showing the soundstage that was used for the cage. I originally cut it from the book, but there is actually raw actual footage they took at that session. As mentioned earlier, the 11-foot ended up being used in only one shot, the classic opening, in which the camera zooms over the ship and dives into the bridge. This is one of the few still photos that exist from that session. The bright lighting of the model against the black background provided a beautiful high contrast view. After that session, and they were waiting for the network's green light on the series, Gene wanted to capitalize on the timing to allow some design changes in anticipation of the series. So on January 23rd, 1965, the Howard Anderson folks held their second shooting session with the model. After this session, the model would be placed in storage, awaiting NBC's verdict. As a result, this photo shows an in between configuration that was never actually seen in Star Trek. Now, a lot of people believe the footage here was recorded for the second pilot, where no man has gone before. But if you look closely, you will notice some things are just a little bit strange about that shot. Take a look at the registration number of the nacelle. It was obviously written backwards. This is a shot where they had used the reversed lettering to make it look like we're seeing the left side, which by this time had holes drilled in it and cables attached. If you think back to the Gary Kirk quote a few moments ago, this is at least one occasion where they actually placed a piece of paper over the registry that was painted to match the nacelles. Then when they were done, all they had to do was remove the paper and they were set to go. They never used the decals. And finally, notice the ends of each of the nacelles. There are no vents. The lighting obviously has been run to the model, but the vents have not been added onto the nacelles. This footage was taken from the January shoot and not from the Where No Man Has Gone Before shoot. And just as we get ready to move on, this is another establishing shot from a different angle with a different technician. Take a note of this gentleman's lack of a shirt. At this point in the entertainment industry, many folks would spend entirely way too much time under ultra bright studio lighting that were used to film the models. It was very hot, sweaty, and miserable work. Shortly after that second session in February of 1965, the bad news arrived. NBC had turned down the Star Trek pilot. But in an amazing turn of events, they requested another pilot. They'd never done this before. While the network had paid Desilu a share of the production expenses for the cage, this time Desilu was asked to foot the entire bill themselves. It was at this point that the previously mentioned Lucille Ball put her money where her mouth is, saved the day by agreeing to fund the second pilot at Desilu's expense. Now, on these two photos, the one on the right side just shows us that the second pilot filming session occurred in September of 1965. So rather than bore you with dozens and dozens of pictures, because there are millions of them out there, we have a lot of footage that was taken when the model was delivered for filming Where No Man Has Gone Before. Now, upon its return from the failed first pilot, Gene had asked for several more modifications. Run power 2 and light up the right side of the secondary hull and the saucer. He also asked for the vents to be put on the rear of each nacelle, and finally he asked them to install a large lighted window on the oversized bridge dome. Now he would later change his mind about this, but it would return yet again as Star Trek entered the 21st century. Now remember, they were filming the second pilot. They didn't know if the series was going to sell it or not, but the plan was to make as many sequences as possible. This would allow Gene to build a catalog of stock footage that could be used throughout the series at lower cost. Now, interestingly enough, this scene begins with an actual reference to optional flop over. I'm not sure I've ever seen any of their on-camera footage that acknowledges that they used flip screen trick to fake out the left side. We know they did it, and it shows up in photos, but I don't think we've ever seen anything in a clapboard that would tell us that. In fact, I have quite a few viewers here today that still do not believe they ever did this. Hey, look, a reverse shot to show off the left side. Now, we've known about the existence of these reverse decals for some years now. In fact, Richard Dayton had been asked many times to authenticate them, but there was no way to accurately tell an original versus a copy, so he always refused to get involved with authentication. But it was Gary Kerr who shed some light on the subject when he responded to the earlier video of mine and pointed out they actually used a piece of paper which had been painted to match the nacelles. They then put the reverse letters on the paper and taped it onto the nacelles. When they're done, all they have to do is remove the paper and the model's ready to be filmed. Quite frankly, using the decals would have been far too labor intensive. Now, amazingly enough, this shot is almost the exact same shot we saw them take in January. How do we know it's a different one? Look at the end of the nacelle caps. In the January shooting, they were plain. Now we see them with the vents that he'd asked to be added while waiting for the answer on the first pilot. Now we see another long approach shot. Like the only shot used in the cage, this is a longer shot that begins with the Enterprise turning to face you and then pulling you directly in to the lighted bridge dome. And here we have another long range establishing shot as the Enterprise approaches you and brings you all the way in, but this time to the bottom of the saucer and not the top. This was a standard approach shot. And this is a standard left to right shot. We've seen these a million times as we grew up. Let's have some fun, shall we? This photo shows you what a normal workday on the Anderson effects stage was like while shooting the Star Trek footage. So I'm going to do a little bit of Hollywood magic. We're actually going to step into the photo where we now experience what it actually looked like when filming the Enterprise. But then we're going to take it a little bit further by replacing the blue screen footage with a star field. And now we have transported ourselves into the 23rd century. And for those of us who are pragmatically skeptical of our little journey into the imagination, well, we will leave you the actual Earthbound raw blue screen footage in the lower right corner. Okay, I want to take some time to stop and talk about some people here because there are a lot of people out there that do things for us as Star Trek fans, and we don't always acknowledge them. In many cases, we may not even know who to acknowledge, and I want to take that opportunity right now. On the left is a damaged photo with discoloration, scratches, and just general plain old age. On the right is a completely restored version of the same photo. It's amazing, isn't it? When you see one of these restored images on the web, and trust me, you do, you are most likely seeing the work of one of these three gentlemen. Two fans have been colorizing and enhancing photos for years now. You can find their work in other places, but basically, Bird of the Galaxy keeps his work on Flickr.com, and Spockboy keeps most of his work on YouTube. And last but not least, commercial photographer Mike McCreel has been providing unbelievable restorations of the old, scratched, and often discolored film frames sold by Lincoln Enterprises and others for well over the last 50 years. His work has been used extensively in books like the These Are the Voyages series that covers behind the scenes in Star Trek the original series. I will have a link in the description below for this. Now, this next picture gives us a unique close-up of the oversized deflector dish. In the cage, it and its center spire were the same color. And where no man has gone before, the center spire was repainted silver. We mentioned earlier that Roddenberry intended to use the second pilot shoot to establish a large library of stock footage to be used in the series. Before I move on from this, I need to once again give a shout out to Bill Thomas. Bill did a remarkable job collecting shot information on our website several years back. Now, Bill reached out to me last year as I was struggling to do something very similar to his approach. He gave me detailed data on each and every shot used in the original series. So in these sessions, they ended up with a total of 8 different master shots. And from that group, they used those shots a grand total of 173 times in 72 different episodes. Not counting the series intros, where various Where No Man Has Gone Before shots were used every season, including 2 shots of the reverse decal lettering that showed up in Dagger of the Mind and Mirror Mirror. When preparing for the series production after the second pilot was finished, several modifications were made to the original 11-foot studio model again of the Enterprise. These changes were carried out under Gene Roddenberry's guidance to enhance the visual appeal and functionality of the Starship for filming. When you're looking at studio model photos and videos of the Enterprise from behind the scenes, you can easily identify the ones taken during the production of the TV series, as they have the lighted nacelle domes, as well as the white balls on the end of each nacelle. Now, this first clip serves to let us know where their filming sessions are in May of 1966. Please note that there were several filming sessions in season 1 and 2, and we may not be able to positively identify where each session that you're going to see here was filmed, other than, of course, the space seed shots. So this footage would become the most seen shot in all of Star Trek. Originally filmed for Mudd's Women, it ended up being used 113 times in the series and was last used in All Our Yesterdays. Now, here's a fun fact. This shot was actually in season 1's opening credits, but every other hero shot in those credits was from the second pilot. So season 1 was the only time that the credits contained honest to God series production shots. After they replaced it, the credits only used footage of the two pilots. Now, this footage was taken for the Doomsday Machine. It would be used about 6 more times. I think the last time we saw it was on Foley and Webb. This shot appeared 32 times in the series. The last time it appeared was in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Now, several shots were taken to help the effects company determine the best way to light the ships on set. You can usually identify these shots because they are not against a complete blue screen. They generally start against a black screen and then continue on into a blue screen. This is an absolutely beautiful shot package showing you what the blue screen background looks like after being optically composited in the 1960s. And this is the first of many shots that they took with the Botany Bay in Space Seed. As I researched these original effects, it became blatantly obvious to me that they took a ton of photos and videos when making this episode. I believe they knew they would be using the small studio model several more times and wanted to make sure they had a library complete enough to keep them from having to shoot any additional footage. Note that this is the only time in the entire television series that more than one model was filmed together in a shot. And here we have another camera lighting test. Now, they never used this in the series, which is really a crying shame because, in my opinion, it is a beautiful shot. And to wrap up the production sessions, we're going to see yet more Space Seed footage. So after the last shots of the model were used in season 2, the model was literally just pushed over into the back of the props department, where it would literally spend years just gathering dust. So here you get a black and white photo of what the production model looked like during that time that it was in storage from the series. This is probably the best dangling cable photo that I have seen from during the storage time. And here's another shot of the same thing. It's mounted a little bit differently and higher up, so my guess is this was not taken after the series completely folded, but might have been when they were simply sticking it in the background between sessions for season 1 and season 2. I got to mention this one. This is Matt Jeffries. And in the photograph that you're seeing here, Matt Jeffries was actually talking to George Powell about a potential work for a television series based on War of the Worlds. And one of the most amazing things about this picture is one of the nacelles behind him leaning against the wall from the studio model. Now, in April of 1972, 3 years after Star Trek went off the air, the Enterprise went for a special materialization at the Golden West College located in Huntington Beach, California. Craig Thompson had worked for Desilu as an office manager for post-production on the lot, as well as a producer artistic director of Lucille Ball's studio theater. Now, as far as the production execs went, Star Trek was a royal pain in the butt. In fact, Gene had apparently tried unsuccessfully to get his hands on the Enterprise, and they flat out wouldn't let him have it. It was sort of just sitting on a raised platform back in the dark recesses of the props department. So Craig reached out to Paramount to see if he could be loaned that model, since no one was using it, for an exhibition that was going to run 1 week at the college. When he went to go pick it up, the props department had already pulled out and was ready for them. It was in 4 pieces: the saucer section, the secondary hull, and 2 of the warp engines. This taken apart condition sort of jives with what we saw with a photograph behind Matt Jeffries at that point. Now, several of the large Enterprise decal replacement sheets came with the model, and there was also a large control panel and converted electrical junction box.
Combatants will disappear. So now let's get up with the fun stuff, like this right over here.